Welcome, beloved anointed ones. The truth doesn't chase you. It waits until you run out of places to hide. Some people don't wake up one day and decide to destroy a life. They practice, quietly, repeatedly. Long before your name ever entered their mouth, there were others, people whose confidence was dismantled piece by piece, whose reputations were bent just enough to look like coincidence, whose suffering never made noise because it was engineered to look normal. That's how this type survives. Not by being loud, not by being obvious, but by leaving a trail of damage that never quite looks connected, until it does. Here's a fact nobody likes to talk about. Most serial abusers don't get exposed by a single incident. They get exposed by patterns. Psychology doesn't catch them first. Law doesn't catch them first. Time does. Time forces comparison. Time lines stories up side by side. Time takes what they thought were isolated situations and turns them into a timeline they can't edit. And once that happens, the mask doesn't crack. It slides off. You weren't the beginning of their behavior. You were the interruption. You were the moment their usual script stopped working. They expected you to fold like the others, to question yourself, to stay quiet out of confusion or exhaustion. Instead, you did something unforgivable in their world. You stayed intact. You remembered clearly. You didn't carry shame that didn't belong to you. And now they're learning the hard way that memory is far more dangerous than anger. The funny part, if there is one, is how shocked they are by the consequences, as if gravity personally betrayed them, as if actions weren't supposed to age. They really thought the past was a storage unit that never gets opened again. Spoiler alert, it does, and interest is added. What you're watching now isn't karma with dramatic music. It's accounting, cold, precise, unemotional. The same energy they spent years avoiding is finally doing the math. And the reason it feels intense isn't because you did something to them. It's because everything they did before you is finally being counted. So if it looks like life is hitting them back to back lately, don't be confused. This isn't sudden. This is delayed. And delays don't mean escape. They just mean the bill shows up all at once. Number 1. They didn't start with you. You were just the first one who didn't collapse quietly. Long before your name ever appeared on their radar, there was a string of people who felt the weight of their cruelty. People who carried the invisible scars, the sleepless nights, the gnawing doubt that maybe it really was their fault. They survived, sure, but survival doesn't always look like winning. For most, it looked like compliance, like silence, like pretending everything was fine because the alternative was unbearable. You were never meant to be their first test, their first target. You were meant to be another quiet casualty, someone who endured in private, someone who swallowed the chaos and moved on with a trembling heart and a whispered apology to themselves for not noticing sooner. But then you showed up, and something broke in their calculations. They expected you to shrink, to fold, to apologize for the way they treated you without ever acknowledging the fact that it wasn't yours to apologize for. They expected you to retreat into fear, into submission, into the pattern that everyone before you had fallen into. You didn't. You didn't crumble. You didn't carry their shame. You didn't let their history become your story. And that's when the entire dynamic shifted. Suddenly, the game they had mastered for years wasn't working anymore, and the rules they had relied on were meaningless in the presence of someone who refused to be erased. What they didn't understand was simple but deadly. When a person like you refuses to collapse, you become a mirror. You reflect everything they've been hiding from themselves, everything they've been avoiding, everything they've been counting on no one ever noticing. And for them, that reflection is terrifying. They weren't built for confrontation with someone who stands steady. They were built to manipulate, to gaslight, to make people second-guess reality until they can't trust their own minds. You broke that system just by existing. You weren't their first victim, but you became the first one they couldn't handle. And that's the moment their past began catching up. All the quiet, overlooked evidence of who they really were, all the trails they thought were erased, all the people they had destroyed quietly before you, they were finally lining up. You didn't start the chain, but you became the trigger that made the chain impossible to ignore. Number 2, they mistook your empathy for erasure, and that miscalculation sealed their fate. They thought your kindness, your patience, your willingness to see the good in people was weakness. They assumed empathy meant you could be manipulated, that you would forgive without remembering, that your heart would act as a clean slate for every lie, every slight, every betrayal. That was their fatal mistake. Empathy doesn't erase, it sharpens. Every small injustice, every underhanded move, every moment they thought went unnoticed, gets filed away, tucked into memory with the precision of someone who understands exactly what's at stake. They didn't realize that you could feel without folding, that you could care without giving them power, that your heart could remain soft while your mind stayed hard and alert. They counted on your ability to see the best in people, to blind you to the truth about them. They assumed that you would rationalize, that you would excuse, that you would soften the edges of reality to make it palatable. What they didn't see was that empathy is not submission. It's clarity. It's an internal compass that tells you who people are, what they're capable of, and how far they're willing to go. And when someone like you finally decides they've had enough, that empathy transforms into a kind of unflinching awareness that makes the other person's misdeeds impossible to ignore, impossible to gloss over, impossible to defend. Every calculated move they made, every attempt to undermine or gaslight you, only added to the dossier of truth you were quietly building. They thought they were erasing themselves from your story, but in reality, they were writing the very evidence that would expose them. They mistook your patience for passivity, your understanding for weakness, and your listening for agreement. They couldn't see that by underestimating your ability to hold space for both truth and justice, they were handing you the exact leverage they feared most. In the end, their downfall wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was inevitable. They misread the very thing they thought would be their safety net, your empathy, and turned it into the instrument of their exposure. They believed your heart made you soft. In reality, it made you untouchable. Number 3. They survived previous victims because those people blamed themselves. Before you ever existed in their world, they had a history, a trail of people whose lives were quietly twisted, whose confidence was eroded one small cut at a time. The reason those earlier victims didn't bring them down wasn't skill or luck on the abuser's part. It was the opposite. The victims internalized the damage. They questioned themselves. They assumed they overreacted, that they misunderstood, that maybe the fault was theirs. That's what allowed this person to keep going, unchecked, to practice their manipulation like an art form. When people accept responsibility for things they didn't do, it creates a perfect shield for predators. It's not invisibility. It's invisibility reinforced by guilt. When someone finally refuses to shoulder that blame, everything changes. You didn't collapse under the weight of what they tried to do to you. You didn't say, maybe it was me, or apologize for their actions. You saw clearly, and you held them accountable internally, even if the world around you wasn't ready to notice. That refusal is dangerous to someone who has relied on self-doubt to survive for years. Suddenly, the script they've rehearsed countless times falls apart. Their confidence, built on the silent compliance of others, collapses because one person refuses to participate in the illusion. They underestimated the power of accountability when it comes from someone who won't self-blame. They mistook compliance for resilience, silence for acceptance, and fear for respect. But resilience isn't quiet. It isn't easy. And it isn't forgiving of repeated abuse that went unnoticed elsewhere. You became the mirror, showing them that their previous successes were only temporary because those people were trapped in the wrong mindset. You exposed the fact that their system depended entirely on victims carrying guilt that never belonged to them. Now, for the first time, the pattern they relied on is broken, and patterns are everything in this kind of game. Because once a pattern is broken, history catches up fast, and all the previous escapes, all the quiet manipulations, all the unchecked cruelties, they start stacking up one by one against them. They are finally facing the truth they never prepared for, that not everyone bends, and that some people survive while remembering every single detail. Number 4. You became dangerous the moment you refused to carry shame that wasn't yours. There's a quiet kind of power in refusing to take on guilt that doesn't belong to you. Most people don't survive encounters with someone like this because they unconsciously absorb it all. They carry blame for the manipulation, the lies, the chaos, as if staying small or apologizing could somehow make it right. But when you draw the line and refuse to shoulder what isn't yours, everything changes. You stop being another convenient target. You stop being part of their predictable system. And that's when you become dangerous in the most unsettling way for them. They weren't used to resistance like that. They were used to people bending, adjusting, apologizing, and rationalizing away their pain. They were used to victims who questioned themselves, who became their own enforcers of silence. But you didn't. You refused to rewrite your truth to fit their lies. You refused to shrink or erase yourself to accommodate their narrative. That refusal didn't just protect you, it destabilized them. It exposed cracks in their methods, cracks that had been invisible as long as people carried the blame. Danger isn't loud. It isn't vengeful. Your danger comes from clarity and integrity, from seeing every move for what it was and refusing to participate in the false story they were trying to spin. Every attempt they made to shame you, gaslight you, or control you bounced back because you didn't accept it. They were trying to weaponize guilt, but you didn't pick it up. They tried to twist reality, but you refused to comply. And that refusal is radioactive to someone who relies on control and fear to survive. Once you stopped carrying what wasn't yours, you became a fixed point in their chaos, a constant reminder that their past actions have consequences. Your refusal to internalize their sins doesn't just shield you. It forces them into exposure. It forces reality to catch up to every manipulation, every hidden cruelty, every person they thought they had silenced. In that moment, simply by existing as someone unshakable and untouchable by undeserved shame, you became the reckoning they didn't see coming. Number 5, they are now being judged by patterns, not stories. For years, they moved through life like a ghost, wearing a carefully crafted mask. Every incident was isolated. Every lie seemed plausible. Every betrayal could be brushed off as coincidence or misunderstanding. That's how they survived, by keeping their history fragmented, by relying on the idea that no one would ever connect the dots. People looked at individual stories, individual moments, and assumed the rest didn't exist. That was their system. That was their safety net. But patterns don't lie. Patterns don't forgive. Patterns are relentless. Now, for the first time, people aren't looking at one isolated situation. They are stepping back, observing the full timeline, seeing the repetition, the consistency of manipulation, the exact same destructive behaviors surfacing over and over. Each act, when examined alone, may have seemed like an anomaly, a mistake, a one-off. But patterns don't care about excuses. Patterns reveal the truth that stories can hide. and what was once invisible in fragments becomes undeniable in sequence. What makes this terrifying for them is that patterns are impersonal. They don't rely on emotion, sympathy, or opinion. They rely on reality. They rely on the undeniable accumulation of evidence that points to one conclusion: this person has consistently caused harm. They can't charm it away. They can't gaslight it. They can't manipulate perception when the pattern itself speaks louder than any explanation they've rehearsed. The moment people began comparing notes, connecting past incidents, and recognizing the repetition, their power began to crumble. All the previous victims, the overlooked injustices, the subtle manipulations, they suddenly aligned into a story that was bigger than any single person's perspective. The system that allowed them to operate freely is failing because reality doesn't bend to anyone's ego and patterns don't lie. They thought individual stories would protect them, that chaos spread thinly across people would remain untraceable. They didn't account for one fundamental truth. When patterns emerge, the past becomes unavoidable, and the consequences they never expected are finally delivered. Their reign of quiet manipulation is ending not because of anger or revenge, but because patterns are merciless and reality always keeps score. Number 6. What's catching up to them isn't revenge. It's exposure to consequence. They've spent years operating like the world owes them immunity, moving through life as if every action, every manipulation, every betrayal would vanish without a trace. They counted on fear, confusion, and silence to shield them. They assumed that nobody would ever put the pieces together, that the damage they caused could quietly exist without repercussions. But the universe doesn't work in excuses or forgetfulness. It doesn't operate on preference or favoritism. What's finally hitting them isn't anger aimed at them. It's the natural result of every choice they made being accounted for, measured, and reflected back. Consequences are impartial. They don't need dramatics, witnesses, or revenge plots to deliver impact. They accumulate quietly, like interest building on a debt they thought they could avoid forever. Every lie, every act of manipulation, every betrayal that once went unnoticed is now arriving simultaneously. And it isn't sudden or random. It's the inevitable sum of everything they refused to acknowledge, every line they crossed, every person they underestimated. They are not being hunted, they are being tallied. And when the tally comes due, it is ruthless, precise, and impossible to negotiate with. They assumed that chaos would always hide them. They assumed victims would always stay quiet, that systems would protect them, that the world would ignore the patterns. They were wrong. Every action they took has been documented, remembered, and connected to the next, until the full picture is unavoidable. The exposure they are facing now isn't fueled by emotion, it's fueled by reality itself. The law of cause and effect doesn't bend for anyone, and they are finally seeing how true that is. This is why their panic, their scrambling, their disbelief feels overwhelming, because consequences don't need to shout, they just arrive. And for someone who spent years avoiding accountability, the weight of it all at once is disorienting, humiliating, and inescapable. No revenge is necessary, no dramatic confrontation needed. Their history is finally delivering the reckoning they always assumed they could dodge. And that realization alone terrifies them more than any threat ever could. Number 7. They're not afraid of you. They're afraid of being seen through you. They don't fear you in the way most people fear confrontation or punishment. Their fear isn't about physical strength, loud words, or even retaliation. What terrifies them is that you see clearly. You see the patterns, the intentions, the lies, and the manipulation. You see the truth they've spent years hiding from themselves, the parts of themselves they thought could stay buried forever. And that reflection is unbearable for someone who built their life on deception and control. They aren't used to being confronted with the reality of who they really are, especially by someone who refuses to participate in the illusion. Every interaction with you becomes a mirror they can't look away from. Your presence alone exposes inconsistencies in their story, cracks in the persona they've perfected, and the evidence of all the ways they manipulated others without consequence. They can't charm it away. They can't gaslight it. They can't twist it into a lie, because you refuse to let your perception be altered. You don't excuse them. You don't rationalize their behavior. You just see it, and that simple act is more threatening than any punishment they imagined. What they're realizing, slowly and painfully, is that their power relied on invisibility, on control over who saw what. They assumed that if they carefully managed perception, if they hid the truth under layers of justification, they could move through life untouched. They didn't anticipate that someone could be present, aware, and entirely intact, while holding their truth as it is, unbroken and unfiltered. And that presence makes them panic. It shakes the foundation of the identity they spent years crafting. Your clarity, your refusal to be manipulated, and your ability to recognize the full extent of their actions makes you dangerous, not because you intend to harm, but because exposure is inherently disarming. They're discovering that they can't hide in shadows anymore. Their fear isn't about you taking something from them. It's about you showing them exactly who they are. And finally, there's no escape from that reflection. Number 8, their past victims didn't haunt them, but the timeline does. They've lived for years thinking they were untouchable, like their actions existed outside of consequence. They believed the people they hurt would either forget, forgive, or silently disappear, leaving their reputation and freedom intact. And for a long time, that worked. The past seemed irrelevant because it was scattered, compartmentalized, and hidden. But time has a way of lining things up. It doesn't rely on emotion or revenge. It simply forces cause and effect into alignment, and suddenly all those disconnected moments form a coherent picture that can't be ignored. What they're experiencing now isn't a ghost from the past. It's the timeline itself asserting itself. Every lie, every betrayal, every act of manipulation that once appeared isolated now appears as part of a repeating pattern. It doesn't matter if the victims themselves remain silent. The truth of what they did exists, recorded in memory, in evidence, in the collective recognition of those who noticed. And timelines are patient. They wait. They don't rush. They simply accumulate until the moment arrives when the full picture can't be avoided. They're realizing too late that the timeline doesn't lie. It doesn't bend for excuses, charm, or denial. Every instance of cruelty, every attempt at control, every manipulation they thought vanished into thin air is now being measured, compared, and stacked against them. The things they assumed would remain invisible are suddenly unavoidable. Their history, which they considered a collection of minor incidents, is now a chain of undeniable facts, each link connecting seamlessly to the next, and each one demanding acknowledgement. The irony is brutal. Their past victims never had to haunt them because the timeline was doing it all along. Reality doesn't need anger or malice to enforce consequences. It just aligns itself until evasion becomes impossible. And now, standing in front of the full weight of what they've done, they're learning the hard way that time is impartial, persistent, and merciless. Every moment they tried to control is coming due, and the timeline has been waiting patiently for this very moment to demand its reckoning. Number 9, they're discovering that damage accumulates interest. They've spent years thinking that harm, lies, and manipulation were one-time expenses, brief actions that could be ignored, forgotten, or brushed aside. Each act of cruelty, each deceitful word, each betrayal was treated like a small debt that could be written off, a cost with no long-term consequence. But reality doesn't work like that. Damage doesn't remain static. It compounds, it grows, it accrues interest, and that interest comes due at the worst possible moment, with a force they never anticipated. Every insult, every manipulation, every attempt to control someone else that went unchecked has been quietly stored, remembered, and layered into a growing balance. They didn't notice it accumulating because they never expected it to matter. They didn't account for the fact that people don't always collapse under the weight of abuse. They survive, adapt, and in doing so, create a record of every wrong inflicted upon them. What they considered small, inconsequential moments now combine into a portfolio of undeniable truth, a ledger they can't rewrite. The terrifying part for them isn't just that the damage exists, it's that it's finally being tallied. And interest, unlike time, has a cruel way of making everything bigger, louder, more impossible to ignore. Small acts that seemed trivial or clever now appear massive when compounded. Every lie once excused or hidden becomes a pattern. Every betrayal once justified by circumstance now screams its clarity. And the accumulation isn't gentle. It doesn't pause. It hits all at once, often when they think the coast is clear, when they believe they've moved on, when they've convinced themselves that nothing they did matters anymore. This is why panic sets in. This is why scrambling begins. They realize the system they relied on, the invisibility of harm, the temporary compliance of victims, the selective memory of the world, is failing. Every action they took that they thought was harmless has grown into a force they can't control. The damage they caused isn't dormant. It's alive, growing, demanding acknowledgement, and finally returning to them, multiplied. And no charm, no denial, no manipulation can reduce the weight once accumulated interest has come due. Number 10. They can't outrun the version of themselves you survived. They assumed that by moving fast, by hiding behind excuses, by rewriting narratives, they could escape the consequences of their actions. They thought that time and distance would dilute the truth, that the people they hurt would either forget or be too broken to challenge them. But what they didn't understand is that surviving someone like you doesn't just leave a mark, it leaves a living record. You didn't just endure their manipulation and cruelty, you preserved clarity, integrity, and memory. You became the witness that cannot be silenced, the evidence that cannot be destroyed. Every attempt they made to distort reality, gaslight you, or make you question yourself failed because the version of you that survived was steady, unshakable, and uncompromising. That version holds the truth of what actually happened, every detail remembered, every slight catalogued, every manipulation recognized for what it really was. And the terrifying realization for them is that this isn't just a memory. They are now forced to confront it externally, reflected back at them in ways they cannot control. Your survival itself becomes a weapon, an unmovable force they cannot outrun or ignore. The irony is sharp. They have spent years trying to outrun accountability, trying to hide from the consequences of their own choices. But the person they underestimated most, the one who didn't fold under pressure, is now their constant. The truth you carry cannot be erased by charm, distance, or denial. It doesn't bend for excuses or fear. It exists fully, permanently, and it confronts them at every turn. What makes it unbearable for them is that their panic isn't about what you will do, it's about what you represent. The version of you that survived is proof that their behavior, which they thought was clever and contained, actually has consequences. And no matter how fast they move, how they manipulate the story, or how they hide from the world, they can't outrun it. They can't outrun the person who survived them fully aware, fully intact, and fully prepared to let reality speak for itself. That survival is the reckoning they never saw coming. Number 11. The system they relied on to protect them is quietly turning neutral. For years, they moved through life with an invisible safety net. They had allies who ignored warning signs, systems that overlooked evidence, and people who assumed the chaos wasn't serious or wasn't happening at all. They counted on these structures, social, legal, professional, even personal, to shield them from accountability. It was never about innocence, it was about control. They relied on the idea that no one would connect the dots, that the mechanisms around them would bend in their favor, and that their history of manipulation would stay buried under convenience and silence. But systems are not permanent allies. They are neutral until pushed or until circumstances shift. What they relied on to protect them doesn't defend them anymore. It simply observes. Rules, witnesses, protocols, and people who once tilted toward complicity now operate on impartiality, and impartiality has a way of catching up. Evidence doesn't need emotion to speak. Patterns don't need witnesses to be noticed. And those systems, once malleable to their advantage, have quietly adjusted, no longer complicit, no longer biased, no longer protective. The collapse doesn't look sudden to everyone else. It looks natural, inevitable. To them, it feels like betrayal, like the world suddenly flipped sides. Every phone call not returned, every report filed, every process followed properly, chips away at the invisible shield they assumed was permanent. Their strategies that relied on manipulation and avoidance now hit empty walls. They can no longer depend on people or procedures to mask their behavior, because neutrality doesn't excuse them. Neutrality simply ensures that what is true, what is observable, and what is documented stands on its own. This is why panic sets in at a new level. They are discovering that their carefully constructed protection wasn't immunity. It was conditional, fragile, and only effective as long as they controlled the narrative. And now that the narrative is slipping from their grasp, the very system that once enabled them becomes indifferent, impartial, and unstoppable in its quietness. The safety they assumed would last forever is gone, replaced with the inevitability of accountability, measured and enforced not by emotion or vengeance, but by the impartial force of reality itself. Number 12. They're learning that intimidation only works on people who still need approval. For years they thrived on control because they understood one simple thing. Most people desperately want validation. They need others to like them, to accept them, to approve of their choices. That need creates vulnerability, and they exploited it without mercy. Threats, manipulation, subtle digs, and gaslighting became tools of precision because those who seek approval will bend, apologize, and question themselves just to maintain a semblance of acceptance. That was their system, their unspoken guarantee that people would comply quietly and carry the burden of confusion and self-doubt for them. But you aren't that person. You don't crave approval. You don't shrink to meet expectations that aren't yours, and you refuse to internalize the guilt they try to project. That's what makes you untouchable to them. Every tactic designed to provoke fear or submission fails, because it depends on a reaction you no longer provide. You don't need permission to exist. You don't seek affirmation for surviving, for standing firm, for remembering clearly. And for someone who built power on the assumption that compliance was inevitable, your independence becomes threatening in the most unsettling way. Every attempt at intimidation now feels hollow. Every veiled threat, every snide comment, every manipulation intended to make you doubt yourself bounces back like a boomerang aimed at them. They realize, slowly and painfully, that they can't control the narrative with fear anymore. You see through the act, and the act itself is useless once it's exposed. The rules they relied on, fear, submission, and the need for approval, no longer apply, and that realization terrifies them. The cruel irony is that their own method, perfected over years, is now powerless against the person who doesn't need their approval to exist fully. And that powerlessness is exactly what shakes them to the core. You are proof that survival and clarity are stronger than intimidation, that independence is a weapon, and that those who once thought they were untouchable are suddenly exposed to the consequences of their own reliance on weak points that no longer exist. They are learning too late that fear only works when it's deserved, and you refuse to give it that power. Number 13. Their downfall feels sudden to them because they ignored the early warnings. They've lived for years thinking they were untouchable, as if their past actions didn't leave traces or set off alarms. Every boundary they crossed, every manipulation, every lie. There were moments when people gave subtle signals, small indications that things weren't right, that consequences could follow. They ignored those warnings because it was easier, because they assumed that no one would ever connect the dots, that the world would continue bending to accommodate their behavior. And for a while that assumption worked. Their arrogance became a shield, and the early signs of trouble seemed insignificant, almost invisible. But warnings aren't meant to stop storms. They're meant to alert you to what's coming. Every subtle look, every whispered observation, every quiet record of their actions was a notice, a signal, a chance to course-correct before the damage became undeniable. They dismissed it all, thinking that small cracks don't matter, that patterns are just coincidences, that people forget and move on. They didn't realize that ignoring those early signs was like ignoring smoke before a fire spreads. By the time the consequences arrive, it feels sudden, explosive, unavoidable. But it's only sudden to them. To everyone else it was building quietly, relentlessly, a force they never anticipated because they never took it seriously when it first appeared. Now, they scramble, panicked and bewildered, convinced that the collapse came from nowhere. The truth is that it's cumulative. Every misstep, every victim, every pattern of deception that was overlooked or dismissed is converging, and the momentum is unstoppable. The shock, they feel, is manufactured by their own arrogance, by their refusal to recognize warning signs and accountability early on. The irony is sharp. The downfall feels abrupt because they delayed responsibility for so long, mistaking patience and observation for indifference. In the end, they are learning that consequences don't appear out of thin air. They are the inevitable result of patterns ignored, warnings dismissed, and reality underestimated. What seems sudden is simply the natural weight of everything they refuse to face all at once, arriving at a speed they no longer have the power to slow or evade. Number 14. You weren't spared. You were positioned. They might have assumed that because you survived, because you endured, because you emerged intact, it was luck, chance, or oversight. That they didn't get to you was a mistake in their eyes, a gap in their control. What they don't realize is that your survival was never accidental. You weren't spared. You were positioned. Every challenge, every manipulation, every attempt to shake you, refine you, or break you was part of a sequence that prepared you to stand unshakable at the exact moment the consequences caught up to them. What they mistook for mercy or oversight was in reality the careful calibration of endurance and resilience, a force growing quietly, purposefully, in plain sight. You carry proof. Not proof in the form of anger or revenge, but proof in the clarity of your memory, the integrity of your actions, and the awareness of exactly what happened. Every effort they made to control you, gaslight you, or distort reality became evidence they didn't know they were leaving behind. You weren't spared from their attacks. You were allowed to endure them fully so that your survival would become the mirror they could no longer avoid. You became the point where their patterns and past actions converged, undeniable, unavoidable, and exacting. That positioning has a power they never anticipated. They believed that erasing, intimidating, or manipulating people was permanent. They didn't account for someone who refused to internalize false blame, someone who maintained clarity despite chaos, someone who stood firm while others faltered. Their past victims may have crumbled quietly, but you were built to withstand, to remember, to hold space for the truth while everything around you tried to distort it. And now, that positioning becomes their reckoning. They are finally facing consequences not because you sought them, but because your survival itself ensures accountability. You weren't lucky, you weren't spared. You were always meant to be the point where the cycle of concealment, avoidance, and manipulation ended, and where the full weight of reality caught up to them in a way they can't escape, negotiate, or manipulate. Your existence alone became the reckoning they never prepared for. The truth is simple but relentless. People like this have always relied on silence, fear, and the compliance of others to protect themselves. They've built empires of manipulation on patterns that went unnoticed, systems that enabled them, and victims who carried burdens that never belonged to them. They assumed that no one would stand firm, that no one would remember, and that consequences were optional. But you shattered every assumption they made. You weren't just another name on their list. You weren't just another victim who quietly endured. You became the mirror that reflects everything they tried to hide, the evidence they thought they could erase, the force that shows patterns don't lie, timelines don't forgive, and consequences are inescapable. Your empathy wasn't weakness, it was clarity. Your survival wasn't luck, it was positioning. Every attempt they made to manipulate, intimidate, or erase you failed, and in failing it only strengthened the inevitable reckoning that has been catching up to them for years. They are discovering far too late that control only works on those who still need approval, that the past can't be ignored, and that damage accrues interest. The very tools they perfected to dominate others, fear, deceit, and avoidance, are now useless against the person who refuses to collapse, who refuses to carry guilt that isn't theirs, who refuses to let patterns go unnoticed. And now, standing in the aftermath, they're faced with the reality they thought didn't exist. The consequences of every misdeed, every betrayal, every lie are finally visible, unavoidable, and unstoppable. They can't charm, bribe, or twist the truth. They can only watch as reality delivers what they spent years avoiding. You weren't spared from their attempts to destroy you. You were prepared to survive so that the reckoning would be complete, undeniable, and absolute. Your endurance isn't just proof of strength. It is the truth speaking, exposing the system they relied on and the patterns they thought would never be seen. If this video resonated with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button to stay connected, give this video a like to show support, leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences, and share it with anyone who needs to see the truth unfold. Every share helps awaken someone else to the patterns, the reckoning, and the power of surviving unbroken. Don't just watch, be part of the awareness that exposes what they never wanted to be seen. God bless you.